The sulfur stench hit Corporal James Bradley's nostrils like a physical blow as the landing craft bucked through the SDC, swells toward the ominous black shores of Iwo Jima. It was February 19th, 1945, and the 8 square mile. Volcanic Island loomed ahead like a sleeping dragon, its Mount Suribachi rising defiantly against the dawn sky. Bradley gripped his medical kit tighter, knowing that, within hours, this pristine beach would be transformed into a hellscape that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The morning silence was deceptive. For 72 consecutive days, American bombers and naval artillery had pounded this strategic Japanese stronghold, dropping more than 6,800 tons of bombs on an island smaller than Manhattan. Yet as the first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions prepared to storm the beaches, an eerie calm persisted. The Japanese defenders, led by the brilliant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, had learned from previous Pacific battles. They would not waste their lives in futile banzai charges on the beaches. Instead, they had transformed Iwo Jima into an underground fortress of unprecedented sophistication. Beneath the volcanic rock and black sand lay a labyrinthine network of tunnels, bunkers, and cave systems that stretched for miles. Over 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited in these depths, armed with artillery pieces, mortars, and machine guns positioned at carefully calculated angles. Kurabayashi had spent months preparing his defenses, knowing that every American life his forces claimed would weaken the resolve for the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. He had issued strict orders: every man would fight to the death, and they would exact the highest possible price from the invaders. As the landing craft engines roared closer to shore, Marine Private First Class Ira Hayes of the Pima Indian tribe stared at the volcanic island that would become his nightmare. The 21-year-old from Arizona had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fierce patriotism that transcended the discrimination he had faced as a Native American. Beside him sat Corporal Harlan Block, a former high school football star from Texas, whose easy smile had earned him friends throughout the company. Neither young man could imagine that within days, they would participate in one of the most iconic moments in American military history. The first Marines hit the beach at 900 hours, their boots sinking into the strange volcanic sand that seemed to grab at their feet like quicksand. For the first few minutes, the silence continued, broken only by the sound of landing craft engines and shouted orders. Then, as if awakened by some terrible signal, the island erupted in violence. Artillery shells began falling like deadly rain. Machine gun fire raked the beaches. Mortar exploded with devastating precision among the advancing Marines. According to historical accounts, documented by the Associated Press and later confirmed by military historians, the Japanese had allowed the first waves to land before unleashing their carefully orchestrated hell. Within minutes, the black sand was stained red with American blood, and the Marines found themselves trapped in a killing field with nowhere to retreat and death waiting in every direction forward. The Battle of Iwo Jima had begun, and it would rage for 36 days, claiming more American lives than any previous Pacific battle and forever changing the young men who survived its volcanic fury. 3 days into the battle, the Marines had advanced barely 500 yards inland, and every foot of that blood-soaked ground had been purchased with extraordinary sacrifice. Sergeant John Bacelone, who had earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, lay dead on the black sand, killed by a mortar blast while leading his machine gun section against a Japanese strongpoint. His death sent shockwaves through the ranks, as the veteran Marines realized that even their most experienced leaders were not immune to the concentrated fury of the Japanese defense. The enemy's tunnel system proved to be far more extensive than American intelligence had predicted. Japanese soldiers would emerge from spider holes and concealed bunkers, unleash devastating fire, then disappear back underground before Marine artillery could respond. Flamethrower teams became the most valuable and most targeted units on the island as they possessed the only truly effective weapon against the underground fortifications. But the psychological toll of this close-quarters combat was almost unbearable. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, a 19-year-old from Kentucky whose mother had begged him not to enlist, found himself face to face with the brutal realities of war. The farm boy, who had never seen violence beyond schoolyard fights, was now crawling through caves filled with enemy soldiers, using his bayonet in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The cheerful letters he had written home about military training and shipboard adventures were replaced by a haunted silence that his fellow Marines recognized all too well. Corporal René Gagnon, a mill worker from New Hampshire, had been assigned as a runner, carrying messages between forward positions and command posts. This seemingly safer job proved to be one of the most dangerous on the island, as Japanese snipers specifically targeted communication personnel. Gagnon dodged bullets and artillery fragments dozens of times each day, sprinting across open ground, where dozens of Marines had already died. His boyish face aged years in those first few days. As he witnessed the systematic destruction of his unit, the Marines' advance was measured in yards per day, sometimes in feet per hour. Every Japanese position had to be individually assaulted, often multiple times as the enemy reoccupied bunkers through their tunnel networks. The standard tactic became a deadly routine: artillery bombardment followed by airstrikes, then flamethrower. Teams moving in while riflemen provided covering fire. But the Japanese had prepared for exactly these tactics, positioning their strongest defenses to channel American forces into predetermined killing zones. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of the island like a malevolent sentinel, its slopes honeycombed with gun positions that could fire on the beaches and prevent the landing of heavy equipment. The mountain had to be taken if the Marine advance was to continue, but its defenders had turned every approach into a death trap. Artillery pieces hidden in caves could fire a few rounds, then be rolled back underground before counter-battery fire could locate them. Snipers occupied positions that offered perfect fields of fire while remaining virtually invisible to the advancing Marines, as documented in war correspondent Ernie Pyle's dispatches to American newspapers. The Japanese had created a system that maximized American casualties while conserving their own forces for the final, desperate battles ahead. Every cave entrance was covered by multiple machine gun positions. Every approach route was zeroed in by mortar crews who had spent months calculating precise firing data. The volcanic rock that made the island so strategically valuable also made it nearly impregnable to conventional assault. By February 22nd, the Marines had suffered over 5,000 casualties, and Mount Suribachi still loomed unconquered above the blood-soaked beaches where fresh waves of reinforcements continued to land under constant enemy fire. The pre-dawn darkness of February 23rd brought a bone-chilling cold that cut through the Marines' thin uniforms as they prepared for the assault on Mount Suribachi. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson gathered his officers from the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, around a map illuminated by a carefully shielded flashlight. The plan was deceptively simple: advance up the northern slopes of the mountain and neutralize the Japanese positions one by one until they reached the summit. The execution, however, would require courage that few human beings possessed. Sergeant Michael Strank, a tough Czech immigrant from Pennsylvania, had already proven himself a natural leader during the first days of fighting. At 24, he was older than most of his squad members and possessed the kind of calm competence under fire that made other Marines want to follow him. He methodically checked his men's equipment and ammunition, knowing that once they began climbing Suribachi's treacherous slopes, there would be no opportunity for resupply. Each Marine carried extra grenades, knowing they would need every explosive they could carry for the close quarters fighting ahead. The mountain's defenders had spent months preparing for exactly this assault. General Kurabayashi had personally supervised the construction of interconnected bunkers and cave systems that turned Suribachi into a fortress within a fortress. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, while mortar crews waited in deep caves, ready to rain death on any Marines who managed to advance up the exposed slopes. The Japanese had calculated that no attacking force could sustain the casualties necessary to reach the summit. As the sun rose, revealing the black volcanic slopes scarred with previous days' fighting, the Marines began their advance. The first 100 yards seemed almost easy, as they moved through areas already cleared by previous assaults. Then the mountain came alive with enemy fire. Machine guns chattered from hidden positions, their muzzle flashes barely visible among the rocks and scrub vegetation. Mortar shells began falling with deadly accuracy, sending chunks of volcanic rock flying like shrapnel. Corporal Bradley moved forward with the assault troops, his medical kit marking him as a target for Japanese snipers who knew that killing a medic would demoralize an entire squad. He watched Marines fall around him, some crying out for their mothers, others dying in stunned silence. The volcanic rock made digging foxholes nearly impossible, so wounded men had to be dragged to whatever shelter could be found among the boulders and shell craters that dotted the mountainside. Private Hayes found himself pinned down behind a rock formation with 4 other Marines as machine gun bullets whined overhead. The Pima warrior drew on traditions passed down through generations of his people, finding a calm center within himself that allowed him to function despite the chaos around him. When Sergeant Strank called for volunteers to assault the machine gun nests that had them trapped, Hayes was the first to move forward, his rifle ready and his mind focused on the task ahead. The fighting up Suribachi's slopes was unlike anything the Marines had experienced in previous Pacific battles. The Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, often detonating explosive charges that brought down entire cave systems rather than allowing American forces to capture their positions. Individual Japanese soldiers would emerge from spider holes directly among the advancing Marines, fighting hand-to-hand until they were killed. No quarter was asked or given on either side, as documented by military historians from the Naval War College. The assault on Mount Suribachi represented a turning point in Pacific warfare tactics. The Marines were forced to develop new techniques for fighting in underground fortifications, using flamethrowers, explosives, and close coordination between infantry and supporting weapons in ways that had never been attempted before. By late afternoon on February 23rd, patrols from Easy Company had reached positions near Suribachi's summit, though Japanese resistance continued from scattered positions throughout the mountain's honeycombed interior. The final push to the top would require one more desperate effort from men who had already given everything they had to give. Dawn on February 23rd brought an eerie quiet to the upper slopes of Mount Suribachi. The Marines of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, had fought their way to within striking distance of the summit. But the Japanese defenders had not given up. Sporadic rifle fire still cracked from hidden positions among the rocks, and everyone knew that the enemy was capable of desperate last stands that could turn victory into catastrophe in a matter of seconds. First, Lieutenant Harold Schreier received orders from Lieutenant Colonel Johnson that would become legendary in Marine Corps history. He was to take a patrol to the summit and, if possible, secure the highest point of Mount Suribachi. More importantly, he was to carry with him a small American flag and raise it as a signal to the thousands of Marines still fighting on the beaches below that this strategic position had finally fallen. The symbolism was not lost on the battle-hardened Marines who would make the climb. The patrol consisted of 40 Marines, including Sergeant Ernest Thomas, a quiet professional from Ohio, who had already distinguished himself in the tunnel fighting, and Sergeant Henry Hansen, whose leadership had kept his squad intact through 3 days of hellish combat. They moved carefully up the final approaches to the summit, expecting at any moment to face a final, desperate charge from the mountain's remaining defenders. The silence was more unnerving than the previous day's constant gunfire. Platoon Sergeant Thomas led a small advance party to the very top, while the rest of the patrol provided security on the approaches. What they found surprised everyone. The summit of Mount Suribachi was largely abandoned. The Japanese had withdrawn into deeper cave systems, apparently conceding the symbolic high ground while maintaining their ability to fight. From the underground positions that had proven so effective, still everyone remained alert, knowing that enemy soldiers could emerge from concealed positions at any moment at 10:20 hours. The Marines located a piece of Japanese pipe that would serve as a makeshift flagpole. Sergeant Thomas and his men attached the small American flag that Lieutenant Schreier had carried up the mountain, and together they raised it against the morning sky. The moment was witnessed by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who was climbing up the mountain with a later group. But his famous photograph would come later in the day, the sight of the stars and stripes flying from Mount Suribachi's Summit electrified every American on the island. Ships in the harbor began blowing their whistles and horns, Marines on the beaches cheered despite the ongoing battle, and even the wounded men in aid stations found renewed hope in the symbolic victory. For the first time since the landing, it seemed possible that this terrible battle might actually be won. However, the flag was relatively small and not easily visible from all parts of the battlefield. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson decided that a larger, more prominent flag should be raised to ensure that every Marine could see this symbol of American determination. He dispatched another patrol with a larger flag taken from a nearby ship, along with orders to replace the first banner with one that would be visible across the entire island. The decision to raise a second flag would create one of the most iconic images in American history, but it would also lead to decades of confusion and controversy about which flag raising was the real one. For the Marines who had fought their way up Suribachi's deadly slopes, both flag raisings represented the same thing, proof that American courage and determination could overcome even the most formidable defenses, as documented in official Marine Corps historical records. The capture of Mount Suribachi marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Though the heaviest fighting still lay ahead, the mountain's fall meant that Japanese artillery could no longer target the beaches directly, allowing for the landing of heavy equipment and supplies that would be essential for the continuing battle. Across the island's northern plateau, the Marines who raised that first flag had achieved something remarkable, but their celebration would be brief. Mount Suribachi was secure, but 21,000 Japanese defenders still waited in the island's interior, prepared to fight to the death. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mount Suribachi's summit as a second patrol made the mountain, carrying a larger American flag and orders to replace the first banner with something more visible to the forces below. Among this group were 6 men whose names would become forever linked with one of the most powerful images in American history: Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Rene Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley. Joe Rosenthal, the Associated Press photographer who had missed the first flag raising, climbed alongside the Marines with his bulky camera equipment. The 33-year-old civilian had covered battles across the Pacific, but nothing had prepared him for the devastation he witnessed on Iwo Jima. Bodies of American and Japanese soldiers lay scattered among the volcanic rocks, and the acrid smell of sulfur mixed with the stench of death created an atmosphere that seemed lifted from the depths of hell itself. The second patrol reached the summit around 1300 hours, where they found the Marines from the first flag raising, still maintaining security around their small banner. The transfer was planned as a simple administrative task: lower the first flag as the second one was raised, ensuring that Old Glory never stopped flying over Mount Suribachi. But the coordination required to manage both flags while maintaining security in an active combat zone would create a moment of perfect synchronization. Sergeant Strank, the experienced Czech immigrant, took charge of organizing the flag raising. His men had already located a much longer piece of pipe that would serve as an adequate flagpole for the larger banner. The flag itself was enormous compared to the first one, measuring approximately 8 feet by 4 feet and 8 inches. Large enough to be seen clearly from ships offshore and from every position on the island where American forces were still engaged in deadly combat. As the Marines prepared to raise the flag, Rosenthal positioned himself about 35 feet away and slightly below the summit. He adjusted his camera settings for the bright afternoon light and waited for the right moment. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but it would be frozen in time forever. The 6 Marines grasped the heavy pole and, working together, lifted the flag toward the Pacific sky, while a strong wind caught the fabric and spread it. In perfect display, Rosenthal almost missed the shot. He later admitted that he raised his camera instinctively, without time to carefully compose the image, and pressed the shutter at the exact moment when the flag was at a 45-degree angle, and the wind had fully extended the banner. The photograph captured not just 6 men raising a flag, but the embodiment of American determination, sacrifice, and unity in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The image would not be developed and transmitted until hours later, when Rosenthal returned to his makeshift darkroom. Even then, he had no idea that he had captured what would become the most reproduced photograph in history. The composition was perfect: the diagonal line of the flagpole, the flowing banner, the strain visible in the Marines' bodies, as they worked together to plant the symbol of their nation on foreign soil, paid for with American blood. 3 of the 6 flag raisers would not survive the battle. Sergeant Strank would be killed by artillery fire just 6 days later. Corporal Block would die from mortar fragments on March 1st. Private Sousley, the young Kentucky farm boy, would be shot by a sniper on March 21st, just days before the island was finally declared secure. Their sacrifice would give the photograph an additional layer of meaning that resonated with a nation weary of war but determined to see it through to victory, as recorded by war correspondents and later confirmed by military historians. The second flag raising on Mount Suribachi occurred while intense fighting continued across the rest of Iwo Jima, even as this symbol of hope was being planted. Marines were dying in the underground battles that would rage for 3 more weeks. The photograph represented not an ending, but a promise that American forces would continue fighting until complete victory was achieved. The euphoria surrounding the flag raising on Mount Suribachi proved tragically premature as the Marines turned their attention to the island's northern plateau, where the most savage fighting of the entire Pacific War awaited them. General Kurabayashi had concentrated the bulk of his forces in this area, creating a defensive system that made Suribachi's caves seem simple by comparison. The Japanese commander knew that every day he delayed the American advance was another day for Japan to prepare for the inevitable invasion of the home islands. The terrain north of Suribachi consisted of a maze of ridges, ravines, and rocky outcroppings that had been transformed into interconnected fortresses. Each hill had been given a name by the Marines: Hill 362, Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, and dozens of others that would be remembered by the survivors as places where good men died for a few yards of worthless, volcanic rock. The Japanese had spent months calculating fields of fire, preparing demolitions, and stockpiling ammunition in underground chambers that could withstand direct hits from naval artillery. Corporal Bradley found himself treating an endless stream of casualties as the Marines ground forward inch by bloody inch. The nature of the wounds told the story of the fighting: blast injuries from cave demolitions, burns from flamethrowers, and the devastating trauma caused by point-blank machine gun fire in underground tunnels. He worked tirelessly in aid stations that were frequently under enemy fire, often performing surgery with mortar shells exploding nearby and rifle bullets cracking overhead. The 3 surviving flag raisers experienced the full horror of Iwo Jima's northern campaign. Private Hayes, drawing on his Pima heritage of warrior traditions, found himself in constant combat as his unit fought to clear the underground positions. The young Native American watched friends die around him while he continued to advance, knowing that any show of weakness would endanger his fellow Marines. His letters home stopped entirely, as there were no words to describe what he was experiencing. Corporal Gagnon continued his dangerous work as a runner, carrying messages between units often separated by only a few hundred yards, but unable to communicate due to the intensity of enemy fire. Japanese infiltration tactics meant that positions secured during the day might be reoccupied by enemy forces during the night, requiring the same ground to be fought over repeatedly. The psychological strain of never knowing whether the next cave or ravine contained death began to break even the strongest men. The flamethrower teams bore perhaps the heaviest burden of the northern campaign. These Marines, carrying tanks of napalm and wielding weapons that could clear bunkers but made them priority targets for every enemy soldier, suffered casualty rates approaching 100%. When a flamethrower operator was killed or wounded, another Marine would immediately take up the weapon, knowing that it might mean his own death, but understanding that without it, his entire unit could be wiped out in the underground fighting. Private Sousley wrote his final letter home on March 15th, telling his mother that he was well and looking forward to returning to Kentucky after the war. 6 days later, he would be killed by a Japanese sniper while advancing across ground that had already been declared secure. His death, like thousands of others on Iwo Jima, seemed particularly cruel because it occurred so close to the end of organized resistance. The battle's final phase involved clearing hundreds of individual cave systems and bunkers, each requiring separate assaults by small teams of Marines armed with flamethrowers, explosives, and tremendous courage. Japanese soldiers fought to the death in underground chambers, often detonating explosive charges that killed both defenders and attackers. According to military records maintained by the Department of Defense, the casualty rates during this phase exceeded anything previously experienced in American military history. By March 20th, organized Japanese resistance was collapsing. But individual defenders continued fighting from isolated positions throughout the island. General Kurabayashi himself would die in a final desperate attack, leading the last of his men in a suicidal charge against American positions. His defense of Iwo Jima had cost the United States over 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead, while virtually the entire Japanese garrison of 21,000 men had fought to the death. The battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, but the true end came not with ceremony, but with exhausted silence. Marines, who had survived 36 days of the most intensive combat in American history, simply sat among the sulfur-stained rocks, too numb to celebrate and too tired to comprehend what they had endured. The black volcanic sand that had seemed so alien on landing day was now soaked with the blood of both American and Japanese warriors who had fought with a ferocity that defied human understanding. Of the 6 men who had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, only 3 survived to see victory. Navy Corpsman John Bradley returned to the aid stations, continuing to treat wounded Marines until the final shot was fired. His quiet professionalism and endless compassion had saved countless lives during the battle's darkest moments. Private Ira Hayes, the Pima Indian who had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, found himself struggling with survivor's guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Corporal Rene Gagnon, the mill worker from New Hampshire, carried messages until the last Japanese position was eliminated. The photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal had already begun its journey into immortality. Transmitted to the United States just hours after it was taken, the image appeared on front pages across America, providing a powerful symbol of hope during the war's final, bloodiest phase. The picture captured something that transcended the specific moment. It showed Americans working together, straining together, sacrificing together for principles larger than themselves. In a nation weary of war, but determined to see it through to victory, the image provided exactly the inspiration that was needed. President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, immediately recognized the photograph's power. The 3 surviving flag raisers were ordered back to the United States to participate in a war bond tour that would raise millions of dollars for the continuing fight against Japan. For men who had experienced the horror of Iwo Jima's caves and tunnels, the transition to hero status proved almost as traumatic as the battle itself. The tour became a national phenomenon, with Hayes, Bradley, and Gagnon appearing at rallies, where tens of thousands of Americans gathered to honor their service. The irony was not lost on the survivors. They were being celebrated for a moment that had lasted only seconds. Now the friends who had died fighting for weeks in the island's interior remained largely forgotten. Bradley rarely spoke about his experiences, deflecting attention to the men who had not returned. Hayes struggled with alcoholism and depression, finding it impossible to reconcile his warrior heritage with the senseless destruction he had witnessed. The strategic value of Iwo Jima proved significant, but not decisive. The island's airfields were used by damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan, potentially saving thousands of American aircrew lives. More importantly, the battle served as a preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. The casualties suffered in taking an 8-square-mile island suggested that conquering Japan itself might require 1 million American lives. This realization influenced President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The devastation wreaked on Iwo Jima, combined with similar carnage on Okinawa, convinced American leaders that only the most extreme measures could end the war without unacceptable losses. The Marines who died on Iwo Jima's black beaches thus played a role in ending World War II itself, as documented by the Smithsonian Institution and numerous historical societies. The flag-raising photograph became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The bronze sculpture, dedicated in 1954, immortalized the 6 flag raisers and honored all Marines who had died in service to their country. The memorial's inscription reads simply, "In honor and memory of the men of the United States Marine Corps who have given their lives to their country since November 10, 1770. The Battle of Iwo Jima ended 79 years ago, but its lessons endure. It demonstrated that free peoples, when pushed to the brink, will fight with extraordinary courage for their values and way of life. It showed that victory against determined enemies requires not just superior firepower, but superior character. Most importantly, it proved that ordinary Americans, when called upon to do extraordinary things, will rise to meet any challenge, no matter how terrible the cost. The 6 men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi were not superheroes or legends. They were farmers and factory workers, immigrants and Native Americans. Young men who had answered their country's call and found themselves tested in ways they never could have imagined. Their legacy lives on, not in the bronze and stone of memorials, but in the continuing willingness of Americans to serve something greater than themselves, to sacrifice for principles that transcend individual comfort, and to stand together when freedom itself hangs in the balance.